Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, aviation fans, and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, episode number 159, and we welcome back our friend Christopher Kolakowski from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison, Wisconsin, to discuss the famed Dam Busters raid that took place May 16th and 17th of 1943. Now, whether you're joining us for the first time or you are a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to spread the word on your favorite social media platform. And Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about CAF, our events, our aircraft, local units, or how you can be a part of the fun, just join our website or visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. And as I mentioned, joining us now, Chris Kolakowski. Chris, glad to have you back, and thank you for taking time from your busy schedule. I understand you're doing a couple of appearances this week in East Tennessee, talking about the Battle of Stone River at a couple of engagements.
I'm leaping around history, Steve, but it's always great talking some great aviation history with you, for sure.
Well, and that's what I wanted to kind of highlight is that you've been with us a couple of times in World War II, and we also did the Berlin airlift, but also you are into history of all genres, and you've got a wide variety of publications and books that are out there, and we just want to encourage folks to go take a look and see what you have to offer. And you said the best way to find all of your books is just doing an Amazon search for your name, right?
Yeah, just do an Amazon search for Christopher Kolakowski. Just remember how to spell Kolakowski.
It's right there.
And all my publications will come up. I've done 3 on the Civil War and 3 on World War II in the Pacific. And they're all available, and I certainly hope people find some interest. There's some great stories, and I'd like to see that more of a spotlight on them.
Yes. And we always enjoy having you on the show. Always entertaining and fact-filled. But tonight, we're going to kind of turn the tables a little bit. We normally talk about the American role, the U.S. role in World War II, and especially in this country, we sometimes forget that there were a number of allied countries who had significant contributions to the war effort besides the United States. One of those, of course, is Great Britain. And tonight,
Absolutely.
one of the famous raids that took place, the Dam Busters. So let's go ahead and kick it off.
Sounds good. Sounds good. By the way, just on a personal note, I know some of you in the audience who may have heard of me before or heard me speak. I've mentioned that for my family, my father's family, my father's father was Polish, my father's mother was English. So for me, my family, the war started in September 1939. So I actually grew up with a lot of these stories of World War II also. So I knew what the Dam Busters were when I was a kid. And this is, you're right, this is one of the more intriguing and one of the more famous stories, certainly of the British war effort, for sure.
All right.
So without further ado, let's get into it a little bit here. And then I know, Steve, we'll have a good conversation about this as we go. But just to kind of frame for everybody what we're talking about here is we're talking about Operation Chastise is the formal code name. It's known more popularly as the Dam Busters Raid. And it's one of the great stories in the history of the Royal Air Force. I would argue that this is comparable in both the psyche of the British during World War II, but also in the memory of World War II to the Doolittle raid to the United States. And we'll talk about why. We'll talk about some of the ingenuity, and that's the second point I want to bring up, is it's a dramatic illustration of the ingenuity that's needed to pull it off. When you really look at the effort that goes into this, it's an achievement, not just of the flyers, but it's an achievement of the scientists. There's a lot that goes into this raid in May of 1943. So let's start with the strategic setting. I always like to start with a map because it's always good to figure out where you are in the world, but it's also good to give people a sense of how does this fit into the grand scheme of the war. Here we are, really the origin of the Dam Busters raid and why it's important starts with the Allied bombing strategy in World War II. And Bomber Command, and this is a map of Bomber Command targets, which is the Royal Air Force, Bomber Command targets in 1942 and 1943. And I want to draw everybody's attention to the rectangular box that's basically in the center of the map right there. That's the Ruhr. The Ruhr Valley is the industrial heartland of Germany. It's where the vast majority of the production is made. It's where the Krupp arms works are, which makes all the artillery and a lot of the tanks and things like that. This is the industrial heart of Germany. It's really one of the 2 or 3 key centers of production sustaining the German war effort. And Bomber Command has been bombing the cities itself, and you can see down in the lower right-hand corner there the inset of all the concentration of cities in the Ruhr Valley. One of the things, though, that they're realizing as they're bombing these cities, there's another way that they can get at the Ruhr as well, because the Ruhr depends on, for both hydroelectric power, but also water for these cities, is some reservoirs just to the southeast of the Ruhr, just outside of that square box, just to the southeast. And so, as early as 1937 or 1938, the Royal Air Force had identified as a potential target that might impact the Ruhr is if you can destroy those dams and eliminate those reservoirs, you might damage the Ruhr's capacity to, I mean, think about today, a modern city. If you were to knock down the power grid, or if you were to, eliminate a water supply, that city is in dire straits fairly quickly. And so the British had identified this for a long time, that these dams might be good objectives to help cripple the Ruhr without actually trying to bomb it completely into smithereens. So that's the kind of the origin of the Dam Busters raid. And so what I want to do in the next few slides, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people that are involved, and I want to start putting a couple of personalities on the stage and start putting some people on the stage. And the first is the man that really gives us the objective and the impetus to do this. This is Charles Portal, Air Chief Marshal of the RAF at the end of the war. He's the first commander of Bomber Command, or he's commander of Bomber Command in 1940. He's the first one to really request that, this idea that we have to bomb the dams, let's really start to look at doing it. Problem is the British equipment that they have at the time, the twin engine bombers, don't have the range, don't have the carrying capacity, and also to bomb a dam with a conventional bombing attack from 20, 30,000 feet, it's really hard to do. But he never loses sight of that objective, and he always keeps it in the back of his mind that this is something worthy of doing if technology will ever enable us to do it. And then he becomes Chief of Air Staff, which is basically the equivalent of RAF equivalent of Chief of Staff of the Air Force. But he always has this idea in his head. And so as technology begins to develop, and we'll talk about that technology here in a minute, he keeps coming back and saying, you know what, this is becoming more feasible, let's do this. So he's really the driver of the raid and kind of the first person to set the objective that this is worthy, and this is worthy of our time and attention and ingenuity to try and knock these dams out. Let's go to the next slide, Steve. So let's look at the dams. Why are these things valuable? And this is actually not a photograph of any of the dams, but it's a model of one of them that the British had built and ran tests on in 1942. This is the Murna Dam, and I'll talk more about the specific objectives, but it's representative of the masonry dams in central Germany. The Murna Dam had been opened in 1913 by Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was considered a triumph of German engineering at the time. The thing is 30 years old. It's a masonry dam. But you'll notice that the dam there's a couple of things about it. First of all, you can see why conventional bombing won't work, because it's too narrow a target. And in the technology of those days, you can't hit it with that kind of precision. You'll also notice that because those dams are very thick masonry to hold the water back and to create that reservoir, bombing the front of it it's not going to work. It's going to take way too much time and way too much effort. So that's not an option. So there's British scientists begin to experiment here with how can you use explosives to blow the dam. And, there are a lot of ways to do it with commando raids, but that's not necessarily feasible in the heart of Germany, as you can imagine. But they figure out that if you can detonate a charge against the dam on the water side underwater, it will create a shock wave, what Billy Mitchell called when he bombed ships a water hammer. And what you do is you use the force of the water, you crack the dam surface, and then the water surges against the face of the dam, cracks the dam open, and then you get a flood downstream, and the reservoir drops. If some of you may have seen the movie Force 10 from Navarone, where they talk about that, you blow a crack in the dam and then the water does the rest. It's a very similar process. They're trying to exploit that. The trick then becomes, how do you get that explosive there?
Right.
And for that, having looked at the objective, having decided what is necessary, let's put our next actor on the stage. This guy.
Yeah,
go
and
ahead.
as we do that, just for my education and maybe some other folks watching, what is the difference between, you called it a masonry dam, and what we would see today, typical of like the Hoover Dam, which is all concrete?
Actually, a Hoover Dam is a masonry dam. It's just they're basically they're all concrete. I use the term masonry very, very broadly. There's really two types of dams that are going to be involved in what we're talking about here. The most of them are those masonry concrete dams, like we think about with Hoover Dam, like the Myrna Dam, things like that. One of the dams that's going to be a target is the Zorpa Dam. And the Zorpa Dam is actually an piled earth with a concrete center. The Zorpa is a little bit different because unlike the Myrna, unlike the Hoover Dam, where it's very flat or it's very acute angle slopes, the Zorpa is very much flatter slope on both sides, both the water side and the air side. So that's going to create a little bit of an issue with results that we'll see.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good question. Good point. So this is the guy who begins to figure out. Barnes Wallis is one of those really significant scientists that helps make helps a lot. When you look at the British war effort and you realize a lot of the technical innovations. I mean, the British are the ones who first had airborne radar. They're the first ones to develop sonar, radar, all kinds of different things. They call them, the slang term is boffins, for all these, the brains behind all these things. And Barnes Wallis is one of those great boffins. He had been he's working for Vickers. He'd been working on airships in the 20s. He'd helped design the Wellington bomber in the 30s. He is a very, very sharp scientist. And he's the one who really begins to he's been thinking about the dams as well. And he's the one who sets himself to the task of trying to figure out, how do you get those explosives in place to blow the dams? And so let's go to the next slide and look at what he figures out here. He tries a lot of different things. He realizes there's a couple of things that he realizes. The first thing that he realizes, those dams on the water side are not unprotected. Many of them have booms across the water to protect either from something simple as wayward boats, wildlife, things. I mean, those reservoirs are stocked with fish, things like that. But also, obviously, bombs, torpedoes, if somebody was to actually try and drop a torpedo in there. So how do you get over those booms? Well, you have to skip the explosive because any other option really doesn't work. So if you're going to skip the explosive, how are you going to do what works? And so he spends most of 1942 and early 1943 experimenting with a lot of different options, initially using tests out of Wellington bombers, ultimately using Lancaster bombers, trying to figure it out. Some of it's spherical, some of it is trying to do dimples with a golf ball. They tried a whole bunch of different scenarios, and what they ultimately come up with is, to make a very long story short, in fact, this is a whole presentation in itself, is what this is here, called upkeep. It's a cylindrical drum packed of explosives. It's basically twice the size of a 55-gallon drum. And upkeep is designed to skip along the water. Think of skipping a stone. You drop it, skip along the water, and then it hits the dam and goes down and sinks. And then the charge on the inside is basically a modified depth charge. When it reaches a preset depth, boom. So that's what he comes up with as the option and as the best solution to do it. And this is actually one of the tests that they run off the Kent coast of England. And you can see, it's bouncing in and it's about to hit the shore. But that's what he comes up with as the possibility, really the only possibility to get at these dams and to get the explosives in place. So okay, now let's get another actor on the stage, and quite a few actors on the stage, because having determined the means, having now determined the objective, we now come to who's actually going to do this. Now that we know what it is, and actually one of the biggest pieces of technology that has to come into place for all of this is actually the Lancaster bomber itself. And we'll see some photographs about it. It's really the signature aircraft of this raid. Because calculations as early as 1941 required a bomb of at least 10,000 pounds that would have to be dropped on these and put against these dams. They realize after experiments, and they realize upkeep only has to be 6,600 pounds of explosive. Now, okay, that's great, but there's only one bomber in the British inventory, and it's just coming online in early 1943 that can carry that amount of bomb load, and it's the Lancaster. So that's another piece to the puzzle as well. And so now you got the bomber. Who's going to fly it? And so in March of 1943, they decide to create a squadron out of whole cloth and assign it to this man, Wing Commander Guy Gibson. 617 Squadron is what it'll be numbered, mostly because that's the next available number, to be quite honest with you. Guy Gibson, it is 24 at the time of the raid. He is, this picture's taken after the raid. He's just a few months shy of his 25th birthday. He joined the RAF at 18 and has been flying. He flew in the Battle of Britain. He's been a noted airman and just one of the great personalities of the war for the RAF. And this is a portrait of him, as I mentioned, after the raid. And one of the things I point out about this portrait is, yeah, he looks like a jovial, happy-go-lucky guy, but look at those eyes. And you can see that he's seen a lot. He's flown bombers over Germany. He commanded a squadron of a 106 Squadron in Bomber Command. Before that, he'd flown in the Battle of Britain as a fighter pilot, seconded from Bomber Command. I mean, he's basically been, like his country, been consistently at war since September 1939 and seen some very heavy fighting. But he's the man that is picked to take commands of 617 and to make this raid work. Now let's look at some of his crews. If you could go to the next slide. This is one of the 20 Lancaster crews that are going to be assembled for 617 Squadron. And it's worth pointing out a couple of things. First of all, this photograph, I like this photograph because it illustrates very much some of the war weariness on their faces. I mean, their facial expressions are a study in and of themselves, but it also illustrates, this is one Lancaster crew, and the guy to the right of the hatless guy is Joseph McCarthy. Not the famous Joseph McCarthy. This guy's from Long Island and joined in the Royal Canadian Air Force and is still in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1943, even after the United States has been in war for about a year and a half at this point. Joseph McCarthy is the only American to fly in the raid. There are Canadians, there are New Zealanders, there are Australians, and of course the majority are English crews, British crews, but he is the only American. There is another pilot that flies who has a wife from Massachusetts, so he's not the only American connected. But that's why I chose this photograph, actually, was to show the lone Yank that flies in it. So it is a little bit of an American story. But the other thing is, these crews, most of them are not volunteers. Most of them are assigned. They basically canvass all the squadrons in one of the groups, number 5 group of Bomber Command, and send people for a special undefined mission. And so you get all these people that come together. Some of them have flown very few missions. Some of them, like Gibson, have flown many, many missions. In a couple of cases, over a dozen or 2 dozen. But they all come together. The vast majority have never served together before. And it's a lesson in leadership and training how 617 is turned into, in basically 6-8 weeks, turned into a collection of pilots of varying experience into a motivated, skilled crew that will execute what we're going to, this raid. And there's actually a case study in there that's applicable not just to air forces, but to organizations in general, of how you can quickly and with great purpose weld an organization together. Guy Gibson should get a lot of credit for that. Gibson was, despite what popular myth would have you say, Gibson was actually a hard taskmaster. But it was necessary because he knew what needed to be done, and he knew the time pressure. And this is Gibson actually in his Lancaster during some of the training. They would fly all over England, and they practice navigation, they'd practice night navigation, they'd practice all the things that they needed to do the raid in England, and try and fly over areas that would replicate where they're going to fly over Germany. Guy Gibson was the only one in the squadron until the eve of the raid that knew actually what they were practicing for. Nobody else did. But they had great fun because they could do a lot of low-level flying and buzzing, and I mean, pilots love doing that stuff. And they had, for them it was great fun, but it was also had a very serious purpose. Gibson did a very good job getting these people ready to go. By the way, I should point out the ages of most of these people were his age or younger. There were, in a couple cases, 21-year-old pilots of Lancasters that were going to go on the raid. So that's something that should be mentioned. But this is actually Gibson during one of the practice runs, during one of the practice missions in April, May of 1943, as they're going around England.
Did they, with that low-level flying, although it's fun, it's also quite dangerous because you lose one of your outs, and that being altitude. Were there any incidents during the training, or did 617 Squadron come through unscathed?
With one exception, which I will show you a photograph of shortly, okay. They actually were fine. They were fine over land. They had one problem over water, which I will show you here in just a second. But actually, they were fine. They did a lot of their training in daylight, although they did a lot of night as well. But they also, part of it probably was England, and they were fairly familiar. But things went fine. Although that said, if people had trouble, Gibson did swap out crews. He did, in a couple of cases, he took people off the manifest right before the raid. In fact, 20 Lancasters, only 19 made the raid. So that should tell you something right there. He tried to train his men to a high standard because he knew what was going to be necessary. Now, these Lancasters are not standard Lancasters. These are modified Lancasters and had come directly from Avro just before the raid. This is showing the upkeep barrel, the upkeep weapon in position. And I put it here because it shows one other thing about upkeep that Barnes-Wallace's experiments, which last until early May 1943, by the way, demonstrate the best way to deliver the bomb. And that is, when you drop it, generate backspin. How do you do that in a Lancaster? Well, this photograph shows you. Do you see that conveyor belt looking contraption just off? Yeah, there you go. You're circling it with your cursor. That's how you generate the backspin. It hangs below the Lancaster like this in the modified bomb bay, and when you're about to start your run, the radio operator has a special device and turns it up gradually to 500 RPM. And then it's ready to drop with the necessary backspin to bounce the way it needs to and get the best trajectory to hit the dam. But the thing is, when the Vickers technicians hang these bombs, sometimes they're not calibrated perfectly, and the pilots will realize it can create a vibration effect. And so imagine a bombardier, imagine the skill that is then required. As a matter of fact, the bomb raids, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, when they do the upkeep runs, because they realize they only have one shot per Lancaster, some of these guys will go around 8, 9, in one case 10 times before dropping upkeep, because they want to get it absolutely right. And some of that's a product of vibration, some of that's a product of just the stress of the situation. But we shouldn't forget this, and just constructing this purpose-built array to hang upkeep and then to create the necessary backspin. Think of the engineering alone to not just to determine what the requirements were, but then to also put it in place on a bomber like this.
Well, I was thinking about that as you said that they started the rotation slowly and moved up. I can only imagine what that had to feel like. And you said, especially if it was somewhat out of sync, that vibration underneath as it just keeps building and building and building. If everything is balanced, it's probably not a big deal at all. But if something's not quite right, yeah, that adds
and
a
500 revolutions, 500 revolutions per minute that's not slow.
No.
So yeah, but you're also getting a sense of the level of precision that is required to execute this mission. And this is the other thing that they train on, is dropping upkeep. And they have some dummy upkeeps in addition to obviously the live ones as well. And one of the things that Barnes-Wallace has figured out is the speed, about 260 miles an hour, and the elevation that they have to drop upkeep, which is between 60 feet and 100 feet elevation. And that's the photograph on the left, is a Lancaster during the day figuring out how to do that and testing that and training the pilots how to do that, but also training the crews. And how do you even determine without staring at your altimeter the whole time? They fit these Lancasters with lights, one on the fore end, one on the back end. And the lights are at such an angle that if you're at the correct height, the two lights form a figure 8. And so the idea is one of the crewmen is watching those lights and is over the intercom instructing the pilot where to go and making sure that figure 8 is sustained. That's how they know they have the correct height. Now, the consequences of that, if you get it wrong and you're too low, are illustrated on the right. And that's the training accident that happened right there. They've dropped the upkeep. You'll notice the plume that goes up, which is over the bomber. It was over 100 feet in the air. And if you look real carefully at that photograph there on the right, you'll see pieces of the bomber are starting to come off. That's because when they dropped the upkeep, the water caught the tail and almost destroyed the tail section. And one of the pilots later commented, if the engines had been affected, we would have gone into the water and probably everybody been killed. But that's the training accident. That's the big training accident that happens for 617. But it also illustrates, in case anybody needed any indication of why the precision of speed and altitude is so important, here it is. So, yeah. So here's the plan. Here's what's ultimately determined for Operation Chastise. It's going to be set for the night of the 16th, 17th of May, 1943. And there was a reason for this, is because the spring rains have made those reservoirs about as full as they possibly will be before the summer and the evaporation, the water levels begin to drop. So the more water, makes more sense. The more water behind the dam, the better prospects for success. They're going to fly 3 waves, each about equal strength, in intervals. They're going to take off in intervals during the night. I'll show you a map here in a second. There's several dams that are on the target list, but the 3 key targets are the Myrna Dam, we've already talked about, the Zorpa Dam we've talked about, and then also the Ader Dam, which feeds over into the Weser River and the area around Kassel. And I'll show you a map and show you a little bit more about them here in a minute. It's 375 to 400 miles one way from RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. And you're doing it the whole way at Gibson's insistence, and I think correctly. You're doing it the whole way under 300 feet altitude. Many of them will fly at 100 feet altitude or less. 2 aircraft will run into power lines and be lost with all hands during this mission. That tells you how low they are. For those in the audience who are familiar with Operation Tidal Wave, the Ploeshti raid, that's the other great very low level mission, air mission that is flown in the spring, summer of 1943. They may have taken, I haven't seen documentation, but they may have taken a page from the Dam Busters. But it was that same concept: go in low, go in under German radar, catch them by surprise, because Germans won't think we're crazy enough to try this way. And we've already talked about this for bomb runs, 60 feet, 240 miles an hour on the dams. And for all of these crews, it's going to be at least 5 hours in the air. In some cases, in case of Guy Gibson's crew, 6 hours in the air, which at those altitudes and with this kind of mission, demanding that kind of precision the whole way, you can imagine the physical toll that it will take on these crews. But that's the plan. That's the concept. This is Gibson's. I like to throw this in here. This is Gibson's crew just before takeoff. And one of the crewmen later, or one of the other pilots later, said, Guy Gibson gave us complete confidence that this mission would be successful. And that was another part of his personal leadership, because he believed and it gave a confidence that it could be successful. The rest of the crews, that was infectious, right? And you can kind of sense that with the body language here. It's very matter of fact. Let's get on with it, and I'm not sure what they're looking at off camera, but it's Guy's got his hand in his pockets there to the right. I mean, that tells you something about kind of their attitude and their approach as they're about to take off on this tremendous mission. When you're ready, Steve, we'll flip over to the map and look at what happens. So they plan a couple of vectors. Wave 1 and Wave 3 will take the southern vector down through the Scheldt estuary. You can see there in the western Netherlands. And the second wave, which actually takes off first because they got a little bit further to go, will take a northern route up through around the northern end of the Netherlands there. Yep, thank you. And then come down through the Zuiderzee, as it's called. The idea is try and avoid the main German flak belt that is just to the west of Amsterdam there. And by using the water approaches, you'll hopefully get a little bit more coverage. And you can see the route in, the solid lines of the routes in. The first wave arrives over the Myrna. You can see they cross the coast about 11 o'clock in the evening, and they arrive over the Myrna about an hour later. And it takes of the 8 aircraft there, it takes 5 of them to breach the dam. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. That group of 8 under Gibson's personal command then flies on, and then just to the southeast of the Myrna, you can see they fly a few minutes over and also breach the Ader Dam. You can see there about an hour later. So 2 hours, 2 dams breached, and I'll show you what that looks like. I'll show you the impact. I'm just trying to give people an overview. The second wave is targeted for the Zorpa. Two of the 5 bombers are hit with anti-aircraft fire and have to abort. 2 others, one is shot down. As they cross the coast, they find some unexpected German anti-aircraft, and by that I mean not just the standard 88 millimeter that we think of, but also machine guns, MG42s. When you're that low, riflemen can hit you, with a Mauser. And so they have some issues with that. And 2 of the other bombers, so only one of the 5 bombers expecting to hit the Zorpa actually hits the dam. One of the others in the third wave will hit the dam as well, and we'll talk about their effects here. But several of the others in the third wave get lost. We'll talk about the losses, but of the 19 bombers dispatched, 18 don't make it back. Excuse me, of the 19 bombers, 8 don't make it back. I misspoke, 8. Which, when you think about it, is a very high casualty rate. And all of those crosses that you see are where the ones are shot down. Most of them are gotten on the way in. One of them is gotten by the Myrna, the anti-aircraft defense at the Myrna. One is shot down on the way out. In fact, that one you see right by the Dutch coast, just to the northwest of Amsterdam, right there, thank you, was actually shot down on the way. It had just passed the coast, and just as it was passing out of range, was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire, just before it passed out of range. I should point out a couple things. I talked about German defenses. There's only one of these dams that actually has a significant flak defense, and that's the Myrna Dam. because the Germans knew as well as the British the significance of this particular dam. And so there was anti-aircraft defenses. The Ader Dam sits in a valley, and the Germans didn't think it was possible to attack it. There was one night watchman on the dam. That was the total defense of the Ader Dam. And then the Zorpa and the others were considered impervious because of the nature of their construction. And some of our listeners may be wondering, well, where are the German night fighters during all this? They never were scrambled. I've seen nothing, no evidence that they were ever scrambled. One of the big reasons is by staying under 500 feet, they don't not picked up on radar. The RAF had originally asked Gibson, do you want to climb and cross the coast at 3,000 feet to avoid the anti-aircraft? And he said, the moment we do that, we're going to alert the night fighters. And we can't handle that at low level like that. You know, is one of the biggest defenses that the Lancaster is constructed to have is altitude and darkness. Well, by going in at low level, you've lost the altitude, you still have the darkness. But considering what is necessary and the level of precision flying that is necessary, the longer they can keep the German night fighters away and not aware, the better. And in this case, it worked perfectly. And so that's something that should be mentioned, is the biggest threat, aside from running into ground obstacles in a couple of cases, is the anti-aircraft defenses. So, but this is the impact here, and you can see they take off, first waves take off about 9:30, within about an hour starting at 9:30. The last planes land again, which are the last planes of the third wave land again. The last ones land about 6 o'clock in the morning. So it is a very long night. And some of those early planes that take off, like Gibson's plane, for example, lands at 6 hours later, so 3 o'clock in the morning. So it is a very long night, a very eventful night over Western Germany. Is there anything I'm missing on this map, Steve, before we take a look at what the impacts of the damage?
Well, and the small graphic down at the bottom, and this is, I guess, when I saw this slide, it put into perspective all the things that I've read and heard about, exactly how difficult this was and how much calculation and precision had to go in to make this happen. It's incredible. It
is. That's why we've spent so much time to understand this map. You have to understand everything that we've talked about up to this point. This is some of the most demanding flying of the war. Executing this raid is some of the most demanding flying of the entire Second World War. And you get a sense of it from what we've talked about in this map, and this graphic here illustrates it really well. You're right.
And one shot.
Yeah, you get one shot. Yep. So let's see what happens. This is the Myrna Dam. I want you to look at the photograph here to the left, which actually comes out of the RAF official history of the war. The top is the Myrna, as an aerial reconnaissance photo of the Myrna prior to the raid. The bottom is what happens afterwards. Now, you'll notice in the top photograph, you'll notice that first of all, the water level is high, but directly in front of the dam is a power station, and also happens just off to the side and contains one of the regional telephone exchanges. One of the, and what the water didn't take care of had already been blown up by an upkeep in one of the early runs against the dam that had actually skipped over the dam and landed on the roof and blew it up, which makes a difference, because think about what it does to the power, but think about what it does to telephone communications in that to that region. When they blow the dam with the fifth upkeep that ultimately does the trick, when they blow the dam, you can see the impact at the bottom. First of all, notice how the water level has changed. That's the gray, the two kind of gray areas immediately to the upper left of the dam and the upper right of the dam. You can see how the water has exposed some of the bank. But also notice the power station's gone. Notice the swath of flowing water that continues to spill out of the dam. Here we are. This photograph's taken about 36 hours after the raid, if that. It created a wall of water 40 feet high that moved at 6 yards per second. and it flowed down the river over 50 miles to the Rhine, carrying everything before it. To put that in perspective for our American audiences, a football field plus each end zone is 120 yards. At 6 yards a second, you're crossing 3 of those football fields every minute. If you see this wall of water coming, it's already too late unless you're at high ground. And keep in mind, when the dam is breached at 12:56 a.m., most people are asleep downstream. It knocks out rail bridges. It knocks out road bridges. It damages and destroys a lot of towns, a lot of factories. We'll talk about the human toll here in a little bit. The German name for this, which continues to be in use today, says it all. Murna Katastrophe. The Murna catastrophe. If anybody's familiar with the Johnstown flood from 1889, the very famous, it's now a national park in Pennsylvania, you get a feel for what the cataclysmic nature of this. And the photograph on the right is actually a German photograph after the raid, taken from the right side of the dam, basically the southern side of the dam. And notice the trees. Notice the impact of the water, how they have just knocked over these substantial trees like they're matchsticks. You know, water, when unleashed with fury, I mean, think of storm surge, things like that, can be one of the most powerful forces on the planet. And it certainly was harnessed here to create some very widespread destruction. Let's go on to the next one. The Zorpa, this is a post-strike attack. It flew with the same recon mission to see what happened. You can see a little bit of scarring on the dam. The upkeeps were basically damaged the front of it, but because of that concrete center, they basically blew off some of the earth, but that concrete center held. Had there been 1 or 2 more, might have had better effect, but the dam held. Next, and the Ader. Downtown Kassel was flooded for several days because of this breach. And I like this perspective for 2 reasons. Number one, you can see how high the water level was before the breach, when you notice the exposed bank right there. But also notice the relative hills around there. And you can see how the reservoir sat down in wooded hills. And you can see why the Germans were confident that nobody would actually be able to breach this dam because of where it was and why there wasn't really any flak defense. But this drew its impact as well. The Ader River flows through a more sparsely populated part of Germany until you hit the city of Kassel. So it didn't have quite the human impact, but it certainly disrupted transportation in central Germany as well. And Kassel, for those of you who are familiar with German geography, I mean, it's not an insignificant road and rail junction as well. And so that suffered some disruption. All, again, thanks to the power of the water.
Yeah. And when you're looking at this, being in that sort of valley, the depression, how did they... So they made the approach the same as they would have for the other 2 dams at about 60 feet or so. Right. But then they would have had to pull up and out to avoid the terrain as well.
Exactly. And that's actually, if you look at the accounts, first of all, they've already, of the 8 planes that attacked this, 1 was shot down, or the Myrna. So 7 planes, 4 had dropped their upkeeps at the Myrna. So you only have 3. And one of the things that Guy Gibson will actually do is he'll fly on the wing to illustrate how steep you have to drop in, steeper than they had practiced, fly it, and then pull out much steeper than they had practiced. So they actually do several practice runs, which actually makes it easier when they realize, hey, nobody's shooting at us. So we can take the time we need to get the technique right. And then once they get the technique right, they drop the 3 upkeeps, and it's the 3rd one. 1 bounces over, 1 is too short, but the third time's the charm, and the last upkeep is the one that breaches the dam. This actually, in some ways, I mean, the Myrna with people shooting at you was a tremendous challenge, don't get me wrong. As a technical piece of flying, this may have been the most challenging of the 3 dams, although that obviously is up for considerable discussion and opinions do vary. So let's look at the cost, both on the ground and in the air. We've already talked about 19 Lancasters went out, 8 were lost. There were 3 that were aborted, 2 because of battle damage, and 1 frankly got lost and came home. Of 133 raiders, you can see there are 53 killed, 3 prisoners of war. As a point of fact, of the 77 survivors, only 33 see VE Day in 1945. Including Gibson, who dies on a raid in September of 1944. Of those people on the ground, there were estimated 1,600 killed, of whom about 500 were actually Germans. The rest included forced laborers who had been brought from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, from Poland, from other places. There were several labor camps next to the factories in the Mirna River Valley, and a lot of them were drowned. And then there were some Allied prisoners of war that were also being used as slave laborers for the Nazi war machine that were lost as well, and they were all buried in mass graves, which you can still visit today. And there's memorials actually that have been raised to them in the Mirna River area. One of the things that the Germans originally felt like it was going to be catastrophic, because the Ruhr did lose half of its water supply, even though the Zorpa wasn't breached. Had the Zorpa been breached, the Ruhr would have lost about 90% of its water supply. But the Ruhr lost about half of its water supply. But they were able to fairly quickly repair the dams by September 1943. And Albert Speer, in his memoirs, later talked about how the German Minister of Production, why didn't the British follow up, particularly when we were using wood scaffolding and had a construction site at the Mirna Dam to get it repaired in time for the fall rains? And why didn't they firebomb the Ruhr when the fire brigades had limited water? And the answer, which Max Hastings quotes in his great recent book on Operation Chastise, lays with the commander of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, who told him, when you fly an operation where somebody wins the Victoria Cross, it can't be repeated. And he didn't think holistically about the opportunities. And as far as the Germans were concerned, that was very fortunate, as you can imagine. However, it does have an impact on the war. There is a lasting impact of the dams on the Germans in the war, because the Germans get really concerned that if they did this once, they might do it again. And there are a lot of other dams around Germany that power a lot of other places. And so they transfer the equivalent of half of an Army Corps of personnel and equipment from other battlefronts to do nothing but watch dams and high-value electrical targets, just in case the dam busters try this again. And so that has an impact on the war. The diversion of strength from the fighting front, those are less people and less equipment that our armies have to face. And so that's an impact of the dam busters. Just want to talk real quick about legacy, because I don't want to leave some time for questions, Steve. As I mentioned, this inspires the British public. Gibson gets the Victoria Cross. There are a bunch of other decorations that are handed out to his crew. We already talked a little bit about how it may have inspired the low level, or reinforced the decision to go against Ploiești in August 1st, 1943, low level. It also has a tactical implication, because Gibson flew in pioneers what's called the master bomber. Is after he drops his bomb, he did the first attack on the Mirna, he uses VHF to direct the rest of the planes and issue real-time guidance. And that gets formalized into RAF doctrine called the master bomber. And you'll see that in raids in 44 and 45. The USAAF uses that as well, most notably in Operation Meeting House over Tokyo, when Thomas Power flies one of the lead B-29s and circles the city for hours while the B-29s come in and bomb the city. And they'll do that again and again. Curtis LeMay uses that tactic. This is where it comes from, is this raid. 617 will become known as a precision strike operation. Probably their most famous operation later in the war is the sinking of the battleship Tirpitz using tall boy bombs in November of 1944. Of course, they're celebrated books, films. One of the most famous British war films is The Dam Busters from 1955. Although Richard Todd, who plays Guy Gibson, is probably about 20 years too old, but who's keeping score? And then I point out that 617 remains on duty today. They fly F-35s. They've flown on board HMS Queen Elizabeth, but they remain on duty and have remained on duty except for a short break since their formation in 1943. And then the last thing here, I would like to give the last word to actually King George VI, who approved this as the 617 Squadron official insignia after the raid. You can see the broken dam in the center, says it all. And then the French at the bottom is, "After me, the flood." And it's set, to me, speaks volumes about the legacy of the dam busters even today, 80 some odd years later. If anybody wants any recommendations, Guy Gibson wrote his memoirs before he was killed, Enemy Coast Ahead. And then John Sweetman's book and Max Hastings' books are two of the best, most recent studies of the dam busters raid, and tell a great story, expand on really what was in Gibson's book. So with that, Steve, that's our story.
And quite a story it is, but not fiction. It is fact. And just looking at the book list here that you mentioned, the John Sweetman and Max Hastings books are relatively new. Has more information come out about the RAF operations, or are we just getting better at ferreting things out, or is it the internet that allows us to access to new information?
More has come out. Some of the things that have come, there's been some declassification. For example, the British Army has recently declassified its war diaries for a lot of its ground units. The same has been true of the RAF, and that was done about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And a lot of intelligence, for example, Max Hastings cites recently declassified intelligence summaries for May 1943, and also what the code breaking was telling Bletchley Park about what the Germans were seeing about the effects of the raids and things like that. Some of it's the internet, but a lot of it is the availability of more information now, particularly those official declassified records. And Sweetman and Hastings really build on that and really get into a lot of that very, very well.
As I was listening, there are so many parallels to the Doolittle raid.
Very much.
A relatively small force trained on very specific operations. The initial damage is not that great, but the public relations impact is huge, along with, in this case, the Germans reassigning anti-aircraft units to the dams, and then in the case of the Doolittle raid, the Japanese forces keeping some of their troops in reserve to protect the homeland. So it's interesting. Were there any influence between the two, or did it just sort of organically happen with this operation?
It organically happened. I think it's one of those where both Britain and the United States saw high value targets in the enemy's homeland, different natures, obviously. But they also realized it was going to take a certain amount of ingenuity to get there. And they figured out a way to get it done and got it done. Yeah. And you're right. Napoleon said once, the moral is to the physical is 3:1. Sometimes the shock of an event can outweigh the physical damage. Pearl Harbor being a great example.
Right.
The moral is to the physical is 3:1. And you see that in both the Doolittle cases of the Doolittle raid and the Dam Busters raid for sure.
And again, the debate goes on, similar to the Doolittle raid with the dam busters. Is, well, those dams were put back, just a few months later. So really, what was the point? But yet, as you pointed out, that flood that took out, that entire valley, going back to the Rhine, took out not only infrastructure, but also, as you mentioned, factories, and displaced hundreds and probably thousands of people who had nowhere to live now, and needed to not be there, so they couldn't rebuild.
That's right. One of the things that they were trying to do was create internal disruption, and by going after the water supply, electric, all this stuff, creating internal disruption, and you see that as a weapon of war, both before the Night of Chastise and also afterwards. I would argue you're seeing it with what the Ukrainians are doing, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East. That idea of creating internal disruption behind the lines, and if you disrupt internally, you're going to see its impacts on the war effort in the battlefront.
And of course, this raid, there are people on both sides who say it was a success and those who say it was a failure. That debate continues.
It's like the combined bomber offensive writ large. There will always be a debate. There will probably never be a definitive answer, but frankly, Steve, that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it worthy of discussion.
Exactly. You mentioned that this raid may have had some influence on the Ploesti raids later on. Were there any other operations that this sort of inspired that you can think of?
It inspired some of the subsequent operations of 617 because they kept, they kept the squadron around, and they said, we'll use this for special missions. And they go after, for some railroad viaducts, things like that. They fly actually 3 missions against the Tirpitz, which may be a whole presentation for a whole other time, even including trying to fly over the mountains from Russia to bomb Tirpitz in a Norwegian fjord. And ultimately, they get her by flying over from Scotland at low level over the North Sea. So the techniques that are used, they then use and refine throughout the rest of the war.
And of course, we have to ask, because we've talked about the books, you mentioned the movie. How close does the movie really follow what actually happened, in your opinion?
Actually, I think the movie's actually pretty good, particularly because a lot of the areas that they filmed over were they used the training flight areas in Britain. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, Richard Todd's a little too old, but by and large, it's accurate. The one thing that I think the movie overplays is they overplay the amount of resistance that Barnes-Wallis got from the Air Ministry and from others. When you have the Chief of Air Staff saying this is a good project and we're going to support this guy, there wasn't a tremendous amount of resistance to get this done. So that was probably the biggest thing. I know why they put it in there for dramatic effect and stuff, but in its depiction of the raid itself and the raiders, I thought, particularly with the special effects available in 1955, I thought they did a great job.
Yeah, and of course, just being 10 years after the end of the war, a lot of the areas that they had practiced over were still relatively intact to make it, give it that authenticity as well.
Not just that, the air bases, because they filmed some of it at RAF Scampton. They filmed it at where Guy Gibson was stationed with 106 Squadron. They haul old Lancasters out of mothballs. In fact, the RAF gives them 4 Lancasters to actually fly during the mission, or to fly during the movie, during filming. So it's got a level of authenticity to it. They're using the real stuff in the real places in a way that you can't replicate not that far into the future. Right. That's what makes a film like Battle of Britain, because you're using actual aircraft in the air, there's a level of realism there that is just, it's pretty neat, and it adds a whole other level to the film.
It certainly does. And of course, it's been pointed out that George Lucas credits Dam Busters, the movie and the story, as influence of a lot of the flying sequences in Star Wars. So it continues to influence.
Yep.
Chris, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I appreciate you having me on. This is a great story, and I think what you said at the beginning is true, is that we tend to look at the war from just an American perspective, but we shouldn't forget the maximum effort and the ingenuity of our allies that helped contribute to defeating the Axis powers. So thanks for having me on.
Yes, and thank you in the audience for joining us. We'd like to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode or any ideas you have for future topics. Just feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. Now, if you like tonight's show, please share it across your social media platforms. Remember to subscribe on YouTube, and you click that bell icon, you'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Buss, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.